The world had been bleached of all color. White snow, white sky, and the white-hot ache of cold that had sunk past skin and flesh and into the marrow of her bones. Alara Hayes knew she was dying. The knowledge wasn't a panic, not anymore. It was a dull, quiet fact, as real as the weight of her own body and the faint, fluttering life within her womb. She fell. There was no grace to it, just a clumsy folding of limbs as her strength finally abandoned her. She landed in a deep drift at the base of a great pine, the snow swallowing her to the hip. It felt soft, deceptively soft, like a feather bed promising a final, fatal sleep. Her mind, a flickering candle flame against the blizzard of exhaustion, drifted. It pulled away from the gnawing hunger, the fever that made her skin feel both frozen and on fire, and the memory of the last 20 miles, or was it 30, of this impossible walk. It drifted back to the warmth, to the moment the world had ended so that this new, frozen hell could begin. It had been a world of gold and amber. The late autumn sun of the Montana Territory had spilled across the valley, setting the aspen groves alight and casting a warm glow on the small, sturdy cabin David had built with his own two hands. He was on the porch, his hammer striking a steady, cheerful rhythm as he finished the rocking chair he was making for her. One of her hands rested on the swell of her belly, a 7-month curve that was both a promise and a presence. "Last nail," David had said, his smile as bright as the afternoon. He stood, brushing sawdust from his trousers, and gestured for her to try it. "For you and the little one. A place to watch the world go by." The chair was perfect. Solid. He was a good man, a solid man. A surveyor from Philadelphia who had dreamed of open spaces and a life carved from their own efforts. "It's beautiful, David," she'd whispered, looking not at the chair, but at him. His smile had faded slightly, a familiar worry creasing the corners of his eyes. "Just need to finish this last survey for the Miller homestead. Then we can settle in for the winter proper. No more riding out." He patted the worn leather satchel that was always by his side. "Silas Kane sent a man around again today, asking questions about my lines." "Let him ask," Alara had said, her city-bred anxiety stirring. Kane was a name that echoed across the territory, a man whose Circle K ranch was less a ranch and more a hungry, ever-expanding empire. "Your surveys are honest." "Too honest, maybe," David had murmured, his hand coming to rest on the satchel. "The truth is all in here, Alara. Every line, every marker. It's our protection." He saw the fear in her eyes, and his expression softened. "Don't you worry, he's just a bully. We're too small for him to truly bother with." That night, the bully came to their door. An early winter storm had descended without warning, a furious squall of wind and snow that rattled the windows and moaned in the chimney. The knock on the door was sharp, too sharp for a lost traveler. When David opened it, Silas Kane stood there, flanked by two shadows. Kane himself was handsome in a severe way, his charisma a thin veneer over something cold and hard. Snow dusted the shoulders of his fine wool coat. "Mr. Hayes," Kane said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "A word, if I may. There seems to be a mistake in your survey of the Blackwater Creek boundary." "There's no mistake, Mr. Kane," David had said, his body blocking the doorway. "I measured it twice." Kane's smile didn't reach his eyes. "My men and I are camped nearby. We'd be grateful if you'd let us see your ledger, just to compare notes." "My ledger is my private property." The shift was instantaneous. The charm evaporated like breath in the cold. A pure, chilling menace took its place. "That ledger," Kane said, his voice dropping to a low growl, "is a threat to my business. I will have it." "No." It was the last word David ever spoke. Kane gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. The man on his right, a twitchy, wiry figure with dead eyes, drew a pistol with practiced speed. The explosion was a deafening crack that tore the peaceful night to shreds. Alara screamed, a raw, ragged sound as she saw David thrown backward, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. She rushed to by him, falling to her knees on the rough-hewn floorboards as his life bled out, his bewildered eyes searching for hers. Above her, the scene played out in a haze of horror. Kane stepped over David's legs and snatched the leather satchel. He tore it open, his movements frantic. He dumped the contents, but there was no large formal ledger, only maps, tools, and personal papers. "Where is it?" he snarled, his eyes wild with paranoia. He whirled on Alara, his gaze fixing on her as if seeing her for the first time. "He gave it to you, the insurance policy. Where did he hide it?" He grabbed her, hauling her to her feet. His fingers dug into her arms. "Tell me!" Through her sobs, through the roaring in her ears, she shook her head. She didn't know. David had never told her. Kane threw her aside. "Tear this place apart," he commanded his men. The two, the wiry one called Cinder and a hulking, silent brute named Gristle, obeyed with brutal efficiency. They shattered furniture, ripped open bedding, smashed crockery. They destroyed her home, her life, piece by piece. They found nothing. "The snow is a blessing," Kane said, his voice calm again, the terrifying rage submerged. He looked from Alara to the blizzard outside. "It will cover this up, but I am a patient man." He knelt, his face inches from hers, his breath smelling of whiskey and malice. "He must have told you where it is. I want that ledger. If you survive this night, and I ever hear that you've been talking, my reach is long, remember that." He stood and walked to the door. "Burn it," he said over his shoulder. Cinder and Gristle didn't hesitate. They splashed kerosene from a lantern over the walls, the floor, the bed David had built for them. Alara, paralyzed by grief, could only watch as Cinder tossed a lit match. The flames erupted with a hungry roar. Kane and his men mounted their horses and rode into the storm, leaving her in the snow with her husband's cooling body and the funeral pyre of her world. The fire was a beacon in the storm, a monument to her loss. She didn't feel the cold. She stayed by David's side until the flames died, until the cabin was a skeleton of charred timbers hissing in the snow. The cold finally began to penetrate her shock, a deadly, insidious chill. She would die. She would lie down next to him and let the snow be her shroud. Then a kick. A sharp, insistent movement from within her. "I am here. We are here." A vow formed in the crucible of her grief. She would not die. She would live for this child. She looked towards the jagged, unseen peaks of the mountains. 200 miles. 200 miles to Fort Wallace, the only place Kane's reach might not extend. She would walk every single step. Her survival instinct, a faculty she never knew she possessed, took over. She scavenged from the still glowing wreckage. A scorched but thick wool blanket. A dented tin of crackers. The butcher knife from the kitchen. And then, a miracle. Beneath a floorboard they had missed, a small metal lockbox. Inside was not the main ledger, but David's personal journal, filled with notes, a hand-drawn map to the fort, and the few dollars they had saved. Kane hadn't gotten everything. She wrapped David's body in their wedding quilt, the fabric already stiffening with ice. She dug a shallow grave in the snow-softened earth, an agonizing, tear-filled labor. With a cross made from 2 pieces of burnt wood, she marked the spot. Then, taking David's compass from his coat pocket, she turned her back on the ashes and took her first step into the white hell. A sound pulled her from the memory, a crackle. Alara's eyes fluttered open. The fever dream of the past dissolved, leaving the biting reality of the present. A fire was burning a few feet away. A man sat beside it. He was a native, cloaked in furs that made him seem a part of the landscape itself. His face, illuminated by the flickering flames, was a mask of hard angles and deep shadows, his eyes as watchful and unreadable as a hawk's. He was roasting a rabbit on a spit, the smell of the cooking meat a dizzying, exquisite torture. Fear, primal and sharp, lanced through her exhaustion. She scrambled backward, her hand fumbling for the hilt of the butcher knife tucked in her belt. The man, Kai, paid her terror no mind. He simply finished cooking the meat, pulled a generous piece from the bone, and set it on a flat, snow-dusted rock between them. Then he returned to his place by the fire, his gaze steady. It was not a threat. It was an offering. Her stomach, a tight, painful knot of hunger, overruled her fear. She crawled forward, her movements clumsy, and snatched the piece of rabbit. She ate like a wolf, tearing at the hot flesh with her teeth, heedless of the grease that ran down her chin. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. It was life. When she had devoured every scrap, he finally spoke. His voice was low, his English deliberate, as if each word was a carefully chosen stone. "Why are they hunting you?" The question hung in the frozen air. She thought of the crossroads, of the kindly prospector who had delivered her to cinder and gristle, of the arrow that had whistled out of the rocks to save her. It had been him, this man, her unseen guardian. She chose a partial truth, her voice a raw croak. "My husband was murdered. They want something he had. They think I have it." His eyes dropped to her swollen belly, then returned to her face. "The child," he stated. "You walk for the child." A sob escaped her. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "He is all I have left." Kai was silent for a long time, his gaze distant, as if looking into a past of his own. He saw something in her, a flicker of stubborn, desperate life that resonated with a deep and ancient part of himself. He had seen countless settlers come to this land, loud, arrogant, and fragile. They died easily. This one was different. "The town, Redemption, is 2 days' walk," he said, finally. He pointed with his chin into the snowy darkness. "It is a bad place, full of spiders." He stood, melting back into the shadows. "I will watch. The land will provide." He was gone. Alara was alone again, but not truly alone. The fire warmed her, the meat settled in her stomach, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, a fragile seed of hope began to sprout in the frozen wasteland of her heart. The next 2 days were a blur of lessons in a brutal classroom. Kai remained a ghost, but his presence was everywhere. A freshly killed hare left in a simple snare across her path. A small shelter of pine boughs erected against a rock face waiting for her as dusk fell. Tracks, deliberately laid, guiding her away from a patch of thin ice over a rushing creek. He was teaching her, shaping her. Alara, the Philadelphia schoolteacher, began to shed her old skin. She learned to read the subtle language of the snow, to find the driest tinder, to move with a quietness she'd never known. Her grief for David was a constant ache, but it was now overlaid with a new, sharp focus. Survive the next hour, the next mile. One evening, as she huddled over a tiny fire she had managed to build herself, he appeared as silently as before. He sat across from her, saying nothing, pulling a whetstone from his pouch and beginning to sharpen the blade of his tomahawk. The rhythmic scrape of stone on steel was a strangely comforting sound. It was the sound of competence, of survival. In that shared silence, a silent understanding passed between them. They were two solitary souls, temporarily aligned against a hostile world. Redemption was a fitting name for a town that looked like it had long since abandoned any hope of it. A dreary collection of mud-caked buildings slumped under a gray sky, it radiated an aura of suspicion and defeat. The townsfolk who saw Alara limp down the main street, a ragged, pregnant apparition, stared with blank, unwelcoming eyes before turning away. She was a problem they didn't want. Her destination was the sheriff's office, a dilapidated structure that sagged more than it stood. Inside Sheriff Brody was a man who matched his office. Paunchy, with a stained vest and the tired, bloodshot eyes of a man who had made his peace with his own corruption long ago. He listened to her story with a bored impatience, his chair creaking under his weight. He already knew. Kane's influence traveled faster than a woman on foot. "Silas Kane?" he scoffed when she named the murderer. The flicker of fear in his eyes was almost imperceptible, but Alara saw it. "He's a respectable man, a benefactor to this territory. You waltz in here looking like that and accuse him of murder? You got any proof?" "I have my husband's journal," she said, her hand clutching the small bundle to her chest. "Let me see." He snatched it from her, flipped through the pages of David's neat handwriting and precise drawings, and tossed it back on the desk. "Doodles and notes. Means nothing. Lady, my advice is, you get on a horse if you can find one and ride out of my jurisdiction. There's nothing for you in Redemption." "He's hunting me!" she cried, her voice breaking. "His men tried to kill me at the crossroads." Brody stood, his face hardening. The mask of civility dropped. That sounds like your problem, not mine. Now get out of my town before I decide to lock you up for vagrancy. The utter futility of it crashed down on her. The law was a lie. There was no protection here. There was only Cain. Defeated, she used the last of David's dollars at the general store, buying a pittance of flour and salted pork. As the sour-faced owner weighed her purchase, his wife, a timid woman named Martha with haunted eyes, caught Ilara's gaze. In a moment of silent conspiracy, while her husband was turned, Martha slipped a small cloth bag of dried apples and a pair of thick woolen socks into Ilara's sack. "God be with you," she whispered, a small act of rebellion that shone like a diamond in the muck of the town. As Ilara stepped back onto the muddy street, her path was blocked. Cinder and Gristle stood waiting, leaning against a post as if they owned the town, which, she now realized, they effectively did. The few people on the street vanished into doorways like smoke. "Nowhere left to run," Cinder said, his lips twisting into a cruel smirk. He pushed himself off the post and sauntered towards her. "The sheriff, he's taking a little nap. We got all the time in the world, so let's try this again. Give us the ledger." This was it. The end of the road. She clutched her pathetic sack of supplies, her mind racing for an escape that didn't exist. "Leave her be." The voice was young, trembling, but full of a desperate conviction. At the far end of the street stood Deputy Miller, a boy of no more than 20, his pistol shaking in his hand. He had been in the sheriff's office, had heard everything, and his conscience had finally won its battle with his fear. Cinder laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Well, look at the puppy. He's got teeth." The world exploded in gunfire. The deputy, fueled by righteous fury, was brave but hopelessly outmatched. He got off a wild shot that tore through the fleshy part of Gristle's arm, making the big man roar in pain. Cinder's reply was instantaneous and brutally efficient. A single shot, and Deputy Miller crumpled to the ground, his brief stand for justice extinguished in the mud. Cinder turned his cold eyes back to Ilara. Before he could take a step, an arrow thudded into the wooden storefront next to his head, its fletching quivering. Cinder froze. Gristle, clutching his bleeding arm, scanned the rooftops, his eyes wide with fear. Kai had come. He moved through the back alleys of redemption like a wraith, a spirit of vengeance made flesh. Another arrow flew, this one pinning Cinder's coat sleeve to the wall. Gristle let out a bellow of rage and charged towards the alley Kai had fired from. Kai met the charge not with an arrow, but with a tomahawk. The fight was a clash of brute force against fluid, deadly grace. It was over in seconds. Gristle went down with a sickening thud, a groan of agony his only sound. Cinder, in a panic, ripped his sleeve free, tearing the cloth, and grabbed Ilara, yanking her in front of him as a shield. He pressed the warm barrel of his pistol to her temple. "One more move, Injun, and the woman dies," he shrieked, his voice shrill with terror. The street fell into a tense, silent tableau. The dead deputy, the wounded brute, and the killer with his pregnant hostage. From the shadows, Kai's voice came, as cold and hard as riverstone. "You are already dead." He let out a sharp, piercing bird call. From the other end of the street, a knife thrown with impossible speed and accuracy flashed through the air. It buried itself in Cinder's gun wrist. He screamed, his pistol clattering to the ground. In that split second, instinct, rage, and a desperate will to live converged within Ilara. She lunged, snatching the fallen pistol from the mud. The metal was heavy, alien in her hand. Cinder, clutching his ruined wrist, stared at her, his face a mask of shocked disbelief. "This is for David," she breathed. She pulled the trigger. The roar of the gun was the loudest sound she had ever heard. Cinder was thrown backward, a look of surprise permanently etched on his face as he fell, dead before he hit the ground. The silence that followed was profound. Sheriff Brody burst from his office, his face pale. He saw his dead deputy, the bodies of Cain's men, and Ilara standing over them with a smoking gun in her hand. His eyes darted to the shadows, filled with a new and potent terror. Cain would hear of this. Before Brody could even form a thought, Kai was there. He emerged from the alley, grabbed Ilara's arm, and pulled her away from the carnage. "We go now," he said, his voice urgent. They disappeared between the buildings, leaving redemption and its dead to the consequences. They didn't stop for miles. They ran until the town was a distant memory, and the only sounds were their own ragged breaths and the crunch of snow underfoot. Kai finally led them to a hidden sanctuary, a shallow cave tucked behind a curtain of frozen waterfall, a place of profound silence and safety. Alara collapsed, the adrenaline leaving her body in a great, shuddering wave. The act of taking a life, even cinders, had scarred her. She trembled uncontrollably, the image of his surprised face burned into her mind. Kai, seeing her shock, was surprisingly gentle. He built a fire, gave her a hot broth made from herbs he carried in his pouch, and tended to a small cut on her forehead without a word. He knew the ghost that haunted the person who kills for the first time. That night, the dam of their silence broke. Alara, feeling an immeasurable debt, told him everything. About David, about the real ledger Cain was hunting, the one that held the proof of his crimes. She showed him David's journal, let him see the map, the notes, the last vestiges of the man she loved. In return, Kai offered her a piece of his own broken heart. He spoke of his wife and daughter, lost years ago to the coughing sickness that had come with the blue-coated soldiers. He spoke of his solitude not as a choice, but as a sentence. They were two people from two different worlds, joined by the common language of loss. "He took your future," Kai said, his gaze dropping to her stomach. "You carry it with you." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and for the first time she saw not just a guardian, but a partner. "We must protect it." The I had become a we. They knew Cain would come now, not with just a couple of hired thugs, but with an army. His rage would be boundless. The direct route to Fort Wallace was a death trap. "He will watch the flatlands," Kai explained, tracing a line in the dirt floor of the cave. "But he will not expect us to go up, into the high passes." He pointed towards the towering, snow-draped mountains that loomed over the territory. "The way is harder, colder, but it is the only way." Alara looked at the forbidding peaks, a landscape that would have terrified her weeks ago. Now she looked at them and felt only resolve. "Lead the way," she said. The journey into the mountains was a crucible. It was a world of breathtaking beauty and brutal, immediate danger. They were roped together as they traversed a narrow, wind-scoured ledge, a sheer drop of 1,000 feet below them. Kai taught her to build a snow cave when a sudden blizzard threatened to bury them alive, their shared body, heat the only thing between them and freezing solid. He taught her which roots were edible, how to track a ptarmigan, how to listen to the whispers of the wind. She was no longer a schoolteacher. She was a survivor. Their bond deepened in the shared hardship. She told him of her life in Philadelphia, of the crowded streets and the noise, and he told her of the great plains as they once were, of the thunder of the buffalo herds and the stories his grandfather told of the Star People. They found moments of grace amidst the struggle. The impossible pink of an alpine sunrise, the silent passage of a great gray owl, the shared warmth of a tiny fire in a world of ice. Far below them, in the valleys they had left behind, Silas Cain pushed his new posse forward with a merciless fury. Gristle, his arm bound, rode beside him, his face a mask of sullen hatred. Cain was no longer content to let his men do the work. This was personal. The death of Cinder, the humiliation and redemption, the defiance of this one pregnant woman, it had all stoked his rage into an inferno. He was a skilled tracker, and he pushed his dozen hired guns to their limits, his eyes constantly scanning the high peaks, his mind calculating, anticipating. The chase was on, a slow, inevitable collision course between the hunter, the hounded, and the mountain. After weeks in the high country, the descent began. Below them lay the final barrier before the open plains that stretched to Fort Wallace. A narrow, winding box canyon, its walls streaked with iron-red rock. It was the only way down. As they scouted the entrance, Kai stiffened. He held up a hand for silence, his eyes scanning the rimrock and the shadows far below. He had seen the subtle signs. A displaced rock, the glint of sunlight off a rifle barrel, a single horse poorly hidden in a stand of juniper. "He is here," Kai breathed, his voice a low growl. "He has us cornered, like a buffalo drive." Cain, with his own grim knowledge of the land, had anticipated their route. He had outmaneuvered them and was waiting in ambush. For a moment, despair washed over Alara. To have come so far, endured so much, only to be trapped at the final gate. But the woman who had entered the mountains was not the same one who was now leaving them. She looked at the canyon not with fear, but with a that cold, calculating eye. You taught me how to use this land, she said, her voice steady. We know this ground now. An idea, born of desperation and newfound strength, took shape. We don't avoid the trap. We spring it. They spent the rest of the day preparing for war. Using David's detailed map from the journal, they identified the most unstable scree slopes and rock formations within the canyon. Kai, with his hunter's knowledge, set a series of deadfalls, massive logs precariously balanced, ready to be triggered by the cutting of a single rope. Alara, using the last of her flour and a tin of rendered animal fat, fashioned a half-dozen small, flammable bundles. Their plan was simple and desperate. They would walk into Cain's ambush and turn his killing ground into a chaotic inferno. At dawn, a thick mist clung to the canyon floor, muffling sound and shrouding the world in a ghostly gray light. It was time. They began their descent, Alara's heart hammering against her ribs, David's heavy pistol tucked into her belt. The first shot came as predicted, a sharp crack that echoed unnaturally in the fog. It was followed by a volley from a dozen rifles, bullets whining off the rock walls around them. But they were ready, moving from cover to cover along a pre-planned route, using the very rocks meant to be their tomb as their shields. Kai let out a sharp cry, the signal. From her perch on a high ledge, Alara lit her makeshift firebombs and hurled them down into the dry brush below. The effect was immediate. The brush, tinder dry, erupted in flames. A wall of roiling, acrid smoke filled the canyon, sowing confusion and terror among Cain's men. At the same moment, Kai cut the rope for the first rock slide. With a deafening roar, tons of rock and debris cascaded down, sealing the canyon's entrance and trapping the ambushers inside with their prey. Chaos reigned. The posse, blinded by smoke and panicked by the rock slide, was broken into small, isolated groups. It was then that Kai began his hunt. He moved through the mayhem like a vengeful spirit, his bow singing its deadly song. An arrow here, a silent takedown with his tomahawk there. He was a force of nature, reclaiming his land from those who had profaned it. Alara was not a warrior, but she played her part. She used David's pistol to create diversions, firing shots that drew attention away from Kai's flanking maneuvers. She was terrified, a cold knot of fear in her stomach, but her actions were detached, precise. She was a mother protecting her child, and that instinct was more powerful than any fear. Gristle, his eyes burning with a desire for revenge, finally spotted Kai through the smoke. With a roar, he charged, firing his pistol wildly. Kai met him head-on. It was a brutal clash, the hulking brute against the wiry hunter. But Kai was in his element. He used the terrain, his speed, his intimate knowledge of balance and leverage to turn Gristle's strength against him. The fight ended with Kai's tomahawk, and the brute fell silent for the last time. The gunfire dwindled. The smoke began to clear. And then there was only one. Silas Cain stood in the middle of the canyon, his fine coat torn, his face smeared with soot, his posse dead or dying around him. He and Alara saw each other at the same instant. Kai was across the canyon, finishing another of Cain's men. This moment was hers. "It's all your fault!" Cain screamed, his voice a raw, unhinged shriek that echoed off the canyon walls. He raised his rifle, the carefully constructed facade of the cattle baron stripped away to reveal the feral killer beneath. "You and your righteous dead husband." He fired. The bullet struck the rock just inches from her head, sending stone fragments stinging against her cheek. She didn't flinch. She pulled David's pistol from her belt, the weight of it familiar now, an extension of her will. She raised it with both hands, the barrel steady. "This is for David," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the sudden stillness. She fired. The bullet struck Cain in the shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him to the ground. He lay there, gasping, his rifle lost. Alara walked slowly towards him, the pistol still aimed at his chest. He glared up at her, hate and pain warring in his eyes. "Finish it!" he spat, clutching his bleeding shoulder. It's what you want, isn't it? Kill me. She looked down at the man who had destroyed her world. She saw the pathetic, snarling animal he was, and she felt the urge, the burning desire to pull the trigger again. But then, she felt something else. A kick. A gentle reminder from her son. She lowered the pistol. No, she said, the word tasting of freedom. Your life isn't mine to take. You'll answer for what you did. You'll stand trial in a court of law. Justice, not vengeance. That was David's way. That would be her way. Kai appeared at her side, his face grim. He looked at the defeated Cain with utter contempt, then wordlessly moved to bind the man's hands with a length of rope. Their war was over. The victory was paid for with the last of Alara's strength. As they cleared the canyon and stepped onto the open plains, the adrenaline that had sustained her vanished, leaving a profound, bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. The fort was a distant smudge on the horizon, a promise of safety that her body could no longer reach. Her labor pains, which had been faint twinges in the canyon, returned with a vengeance, sharp and insistent, brought on by the violence and the stress. She stumbled, her legs giving out from under her. She fell to her knees in the thin snow. I can't, she whispered, tears of pure frustration and agony tracking paths through the grime on her face. I'm so close. Kai looked at her, then at the fort, then at the bound and shuffling figure of Silas Cain being towed behind his horse. He walked to Alara. His calloused hands were surprisingly gentle as he lifted her. She was lighter than he expected, a bird with a broken wing. He adjusted her weight in his arms, holding her securely against his chest. He had carried the heavy burden of his own grief for a decade. This new weight was different. It was a weight of purpose, of hope. I will carry you, Adada, he said, his voice soft. The child will be born in a safe place. He began to walk. The image was a portrait of the West itself, stark and strange and powerful. The Comanche hunter, the last of his line, carrying the pregnant widow who represented a new future. Behind them, their vanquished enemy stumbled along, a prisoner destined for the white man's justice. It was the end of a 200-mile journey. It was the last mile home. The U.S. cavalry soldiers at the gates of Fort Wallace watched the procession approach in stunned silence. They saw the native warrior, the woman in his arms, and the infamous, powerful Silas Cain, bound and bleeding. A captain, a man with a stern face and intelligent eyes, came out to meet them. Kai gently set Alara down on a bench just inside the gate. She was pale and weak, but her eyes burned with an unyielding light. This man, she said, her voice thin but firm, pointing a trembling finger at Cain, is Silas Cain. He murdered my husband, David Hayes, a federal surveyor. He is wanted for land fraud and murder. The captain looked skeptical. Accusations against a man like Cain were dangerous. But then Alara reached into her bundle and produced the small, mud-stained journal. The proof of his motives is in here, she said. And the full ledger, the one he killed for? My husband buried it under the hearthstone of our cabin. He said if anything happened, the truth would be safe in the heart of our home. The captain looked from the earnest, battered woman to the snarling, defeated Cain, and he knew he was looking at the truth. Take this man to the stockade, he barked to his soldiers, and get the doctor for Mrs. Hayes. Now! As they dragged Cain away, he shot one last look of pure hatred at Alara. He had been undone by the one person in the world he had dismissed as worthless. A profound sense of closure washed over her as she watched him disappear. It was over. The infirmary was clean and warm, a world away from the snow and the violence. Hours later, Alara lay in a narrow bed, no longer a widow carrying a promise, but a mother holding a miracle. Her son, small but fierce and healthy, slept against her chest. Kai stood by the window, a silent silhouette against the setting sun, looking out at the endless land that was his home. Kai, she called softly. He turned. I want to name him, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Tears she hadn't realized she was holding back began to trace clean paths down her cheeks. I want to name him David. Kai Hayes. The stoic mask on the hunter's face crumbled. For the first time, a genuine, gentle smile touched his lips. transforming his harsh features. He walked to her bedside and looked down at the tiny, sleeping child. He reached out a single calloused finger. The baby's hand, impossibly small, instinctively curled around it. A new family, forged in fire and ice and blood, had been born. The future that had been stolen had been reclaimed. The camera of the mind holds on that image. The mother, the child, and the hunter. A quiet trinity of hope. And beneath the silence, a new sound fills the room. The steady, rhythmic, and triumphant beat of a tiny human heart.